Greetings. Welcome to the Politics of Prosecution video series. My name is Scott Ingram. I'm an assistant professor of criminal justice at High Point University. This is the first episode of 6. We're going to look at the relationship between politics and prosecution. This particular video series, in addition to being a standalone series where you can learn about the relationship between politics and prosecution and how criminal prosecution works in the United States, is also a companion to the Politics of Prosecution podcast. You can find that podcast on iTunes and Spotify. You can also follow us on Instagram at poly, P-O-L-I, period N, period pros, P-R-O-S, or you can follow us on Twitter, poly_PROS. In addition to that, look for the forthcoming Politics of Prosecution case study series, where we're going to take the principles and ideas that we talk about through this video series and apply them to real-life cases and look at how these principles play out on a day-to-day basis. Finally, this also goes along with a course taught at High Point University called The Politics of Prosecution. It is that class that also provides some of the content for our podcast. So please follow along, and hopefully you will find these particular videos fascinating and educational because criminal prosecution plays a central role in current events, in the way the government operates, the way that the government and the people interact on a day-to-day basis. This first episode is going to provide an overview of that and try and flesh out a little bit about what we mean when we talk about the relationship between politics and prosecution. What is it exactly that we are talking about? The fundamental idea of this video series is that the use of prosecutorial power, or the refusal to use it, is an inherently political act because it is the government's decision to use or not to use its coercive law enforcement power against a specific individual. Now, that is a very broad statement. We need to get into some of the details of what we mean by those terms. The first is prosecutorial power. What is it that we're talking about when we say prosecutorial power? Well, prosecutors in the United States possess a tremendous amount of discretion, a tremendous amount of ability to investigate, to initiate, to negotiate, and to resolve criminal cases. What does that basically mean? Well, they participate in criminal investigations, especially at a federal level, but also more at a state level. They will help law enforcement actually investigate criminal activity. They are essential to securing certain types of evidence, such as electronic evidence, whether it be through a search warrant, whether it be through subpoenas. Prosecutors have to be involved in that process. They also are responsible for initiating criminal cases. So once the investigation has been completed, if there's enough evidence to believe that a crime has occurred, the prosecutors are the ones who initiate those criminal charges. Next, they are able to negotiate. So once the charges have been filed, now the question becomes what happens to the defendant? Does the defendant go to trial? Does the defendant negotiate some sort of settlement where they plead guilty in exchange for something? In nearly every single criminal case, the defendant is going to plead guilty, and that's going to require some sort of negotiation between the defendant and the prosecutor, so the prosecutor handles that. And finally, the prosecutor can resolve cases. The prosecutor has the power to dismiss charges at any point along the process for almost any reason that they want to. And so they can take all of these steps on their own throughout the entire process. So when we talk about prosecutorial power, that's what we're talking about. Now, what is a political act? Right? A political act is an effort to use or to exercise power In this particular context, we tend to talk about governmental power. Right? So law enforcement is all government. It is the police, it is state police, it can be federal investigators, whether that be the FBI, whether it be DEA, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Agriculture. They all have their own criminal investigators. So there's a wide range of governmental authority that exists out there that can engage in these different acts. The Constitution also gives the government the authority to do this. Law enforcement power has been placed into state hands. And when I say state, I'm talking about states such as North Carolina, New York, Missouri, California, Washington, right? We're talking about the state themselves. But the Constitution also gives the federal government the power to enforce its own laws. And so when they do that, they must conform to the constitutional requirements. And so the Constitution can place limits on the different types of political acts engaged in by law enforcement and therefore the government as well. Made reference to this already, but when we talk about the government, what do we mean? Well, in the United States, we generally have 3 different levels of government. Closest to the individual is local government. So as I sit here in High Point, North Carolina, we have the High Point Police Department, and they are able to conduct law enforcement activities within the city limits of High Point. But we are also in Guilford County. Guilford County has its own sheriff's department, and it's going to enforce and police the non-incorporated areas of Guilford County. On top of that, then, we have the state authority. Right? So that's going to be the State Bureau of Investigation, the state police in North Carolina. And so you have a state authority that covers the entire state of North Carolina. Then on top of that, we have the federal government. The federal government with all its different agencies, with all its different law enforcement capabilities, all the different things the federal government will do on a day-to-day basis, all of that also is layered on top of this government apparatus. And so when we talk about government power, it can be any of those 3 agencies. This decision, when it comes to criminal prosecution, is a unilateral decision. So when the government makes this decision, it does so without any real oversight. The only requirement is that they must have probable cause to pursue criminal charges. Beyond that, there is no standard. Courts will oversee it, and they will review to make sure there's probable cause. If the case goes to trial and they can't prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, the defendant's going to be found not guilty, but that doesn't mean the prosecutor cannot file charges on proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They only need probable cause. So for the government to file charges, they need probable cause. To secure a conviction, it must be proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Those are really the only oversight mechanisms that occur in our system, and when you have well over 90% of the criminal defendants pleading guilty, the proof beyond a reasonable doubt standard is not a difficult one for the prosecutors to make. Now, I talked about this nature of coercive law enforcement power. What does that mean? Right? It basically means that we use law enforcement as a way to coerce people to follow the law. So a quick example of this is the speed limit. So you're driving down the highway, the speed limit says 65 miles an hour, but what's there to say you're actually going to drive 65, right? All the traffic around you may be going 75 or 80 miles an hour. You may be in a hurry to get someplace. That sign telling you that you can only go 65 miles an hour is not going to be much of a deterrent or a way to get you to follow the law. However, what will get you to follow the law is when the police car pulls up behind you, turns on the lights, and pulls you over. And now you are being essentially coerced to follow the law because you don't want the consequences of having to pay hundreds of dollars in legal fees and court costs and the traffic ticket and points on your license and increased insurance and all of that. So that is how law enforcement coerces compliance with the law. They can simply sit there on the side of the road and their presence is going to get you to follow the law. Now, that's a speeding ticket. The same thing is going to apply for any other criminal activity, whether you talk about drug use, whether you're talking about assaults, whether you're talking about murders, whether you're talking about money laundering, whether you're talking about bank fraud, right? All of those things, the government is trying to take steps to send the message that you need to follow the laws as written. Now, all of this leads to a single question. Why is that coercive power used in some cases, and why is it not used in other cases? Now, let's go back to our speeding example. I'm driving down the highway at 80 miles an hour. I see a police car up ahead. I begin to slow down, but I don't slow down enough. I get down to 70 miles an hour rather than 65 miles an hour, which is the speed limit. The police officer using the radar gun can clearly see that I am not going 65 miles an hour and that I'm going faster than 65 miles an hour. However, the police officer decides, for whatever reason, not to pull me over. Right? I drive by, I breathe a sigh of relief when I don't see the police car pulling in behind me, turning on lights. But that police officer made a decision not to enforce the law in my particular case. So why is it that they're going to do that in one case and not the other? Well, prosecutors operate the same way as the police do. They're going to take a look at a case and they're going to say, no, in this particular case, we're not going to use our prosecutorial power. In the same instance, they may look at another case and say, yes, in this case, we do want to use our prosecutorial power. So what's the difference? What makes that difference? That is what this Politics of Prosecution video series is all about, is trying to tease out some of those reasons why the government is going to use its prosecutorial power in some instances and not others. And there's some related questions that come with that. Who does the prosecutor use it against? We have heard in recent years that immigration has been an important issue. One president has said that he was not going to enforce the immigration laws in certain instances. Another president has come in and said, yes, we are going to enforce the immigration laws and we're going to make them even more stringent. Two different approaches. How do they decide against whom this is going to be used? Under what circumstances do we use it? Are there certain circumstances that we're more likely to use the prosecutorial power than others? For example, we may look at case severity. Do we perceive murder cases as being more or less serious than if you dig, say, ginseng out of season? Right? And yes, that is actually an offense. In the murder case, we may be more likely to use it. In our ginseng case, we may say, you know what, it's not as important, we're not going to use it. Therefore, we have to figure out, what circumstances is important to use, what circumstances is it not as important. What reasons? What are the reasons that we give for initiating criminal cases? What are the reasons that we give for initiating that criminal process? There can be a whole host of them. And there's lots of political power reasons that go into these particular decisions. And so we need to start teasing those things out and understanding how it works. How do they make these decisions? What is the process that they use? Why do some cases get prosecuted at certain times and not at others? Are there certain procedures that some places follow that others don't? Are there certain requirements that they have that other places do not? Right? All of these things factor into whether or not we file charges in a given case. And finally, there are certain external factors that are going to influence the decision. We may find that the community demands certain things be prosecuted. We may find that the community doesn't want other things to be prosecuted. Right? Those are external factors. Whether or not the case is high profile or not, does it get public attention? Most cases don't. Most cases go through the court system, nobody even knows that they have occurred. But some cases catch people's attention, right? Those external factors can make a difference as well. And so as we look at politics of prosecution and understand how prosecutors decide whether or not to use this particular power that they have to work through the criminal court process, those are going to be the questions that we have to tease out. Those are going to be the questions that we have to answer. Now, this has been our introduction. It is episode 1. Episode 2 is going to look at our governmental structure. It is meant to be a very foundational piece. You can almost think of it as Civics 101. We're going to review the Constitution. What does the Constitution say about governmental power? When can they use it? When they can't? What's the relationship between the state government and the federal government? What's this thing called separation of powers mean? We're going to dig into the actual text of the Constitution and see what it has to say. Next episode, episode 3, is going to look at the criminal court process. We're going to look at how a case moves through the system, what rights do people have, and how does that play out. In other words, what is the operational environment that the prosecutor is working in? Episode 4 is then going to introduce us to the prosecutorial function. We'll look at who prosecutors are, what do they do, where do they come from. Then we'll get into episode 5 and episode 6. These are going to look specifically at the politics and prosecution relationship. We're going to look in episode 5 about how prosecutors engage in politics. Right? How do prosecutors use their power for political purposes? And then we're going to flip it around in episode 6, and we're going to look at how do politics constrain or influence prosecutorial decision making. Thank you for watching this first episode of the Politics of Prosecution video series. I urge you to subscribe to this channel. Also, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at these 2 places. And finally, you can find our podcast on iTunes and Spotify.